This is shit. This is way better. But they look the same, you might ask. Well, they're not. Underneath, they're completely different. Let me explain. This is the enemy selection screen for Foot Joust. It's old, like 2 years old. I made this when I first started learning the game development, which is a massive problem for a few reasons. The first one being spaghetti. This code is all over the place. It's a mess. Kind of like, well, spaghetti. Relying on too many dependencies and a lot of handmade and hard-coded work. This system is important because it tracks what enemies the player wants to fight during their run. At the time, when I didn't know any better, I created each one of these buttons by hand, which required a lot of manual input, and references upon more references in the editor. Implementing a new enemy took a considerable amount of time, and a lot more manual inputting, and I put up with it just because it worked. Over time, I had to expand the system, adding new features like the requirement of other enemies to be able to select them, and the boss mode, which pulls in a select range of enemies into one run. This complicated things, and I had to keep building on top of the pre-existing code, trying to shove in ideas that just did not work with the existing framework. As I complicated things, I had to make strange fixes and weird workarounds. Things got out of control, but the straw that broke the camel's back was when I was playtesting on the mobile version. I was having continuous issues when the enemy selection was getting out of sync. After making changes, it would just revert back to the enemies who were selected from a previous run. I couldn't release the game in the state, and more importantly the demo that I was preparing to release, which you can now go and play over at my itch.io page. So I said, f it, and decided to get out my metaphorical sledgehammer and demolish the system. After safely creating a backup, of course. Now, the next part is kind of a blur. I had to track down and eliminate every trace and variant of the enemy selection screen, which was scattered everywhere and had multiple instances of the same thing in different places. Then I had to fix any remaining reference issues. There were a lot, but after everything was cleared up, I got to work. Now, as I mentioned before, each one of these buttons was handcrafted and placed here manually that contained their information to talk to the web of other systems. So the solution to this was moving all the information about the enemy away from these buttons and creating a centralized system that from the ground up also understands all the new mechanics and features that were previously tacked on. It will also serve as the central database of all the enemy information. And now we have this nice little array that is a part of our enemy selection manager, which contains all of its useful info, including its ID, and if it's a boss or not. Since bosses prevent the player from choosing what enemies are in a run and are specifically curated. The cool thing about this is now I have an easier to access field where I can punch in the ID of each enemy that is a part of their run. Now with that all sorted, every time the screen is called, the newly created enemy selection manager is able to dynamically create and fill in this grid one by one with buttons based on our new list of enemies. These buttons also get given its ID number, so when it's pressed, it's able to talk back to the enemy selection manager and do all the correct calculations to handle what is happening, and manage this threshold that allows each player to start a run based on the requirements of each enemy that's already selected. Then all I had to do was feed the relevant information, like which enemies were selected, back into the save system so it could be stored for when the player changes scenes or restarts the game the next time. And that was it. Oh, and I also broke the spawn system and had to rejig that too, but moving on. Overall, the system only took a week to do. That also includes working a full-time job. I was really on the fence about doing this for a very long time. It was hard to predict what kind of time-consuming mess this would cause if things went disastrously bad, but it didn't, so I'm glad it worked out so well. Because of this, it will save me hours of work in the future when implementing new enemies. I could just key it all in and the systems will do the rest of the work. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you're interested in playing the demo for Foot Joust, follow the link below, etc., like, subscribe, whatever. Bye.